continuing with the Amalekites in my video series entitled Genocide in the Bible. I'm looking at some questions that are raised from 1 Samuel 15, and so I'm just going to pick up where I left off. But doesn't the justice of the biblical God in this situation look more like the most horrific of war crimes? Let me see if I can clarify my response here somewhat. The justice of the biblical God is not the sole cause of the military action against the Amalekite warrior class in this case. It clearly includes the making of a final defense for Israel and actually for other victim nations and groups of surrounding lands. Israel would not have been the only source of slaves and raided goods against an unusually malevolent and violent aggressor group. As I pointed out in an earlier video from the biblical text, the cause was broader than the single verse in 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 2, but included the factors in the other passages I mentioned in the other videos. In fact, if we want to question something about God's character, we would be closer to the truth if we accused him of reprehensible leniency. For he allowed this group of Amalekites to terrorize Israel for 200 to 400 years before he dealt decisively with the issue. And he allowed individual Amalekites to migrate into the Israelite culture without penalty. This is patience to a fault almost. His heart resists judgment and acts of punitive finality, and he waits as long as he can before executing these types of actions. Another point I would make is the killing of the innocents is not the target of the justice per se, just as damage to tents, clothes, or animals would not be. His justice actions are specifically directed against the warrior class and leadership, explicitly those that actually perform the acts of violence against Israel. Even in the main passage in 1 Samuel 15, the leadership seems to be the main focus, as the phrase "destroy all he has" would indicate. Following this is the list of what is included, and it is a general list including people and animals. It is difficult to make this order implicate that oxen are being guilty of atrocity against Israel, just as women and children would have been actually participated in the initial raid against Israel typically. And probably the women and children and animals were considered by nomadic Amalekites as property, since they were routinely captured, sold, and traded. I should also point out that in ancient Near East justice, you had this principle of an eye for an eye. Well, the Amalekites, when they attacked other nations or other people like the Israelites, they wiped out everything. They destroyed everything. And so it would seem that if, just from a pure justice standpoint, that their punishment would be the same in return. But that's just a side point. Another point I'd make is indicated above. The killing of the innocents would be an issue of mercy killing. I brought that up in the last couple of videos, given the desert environment and the situation we've discussed, and at least the least painful, least dehumanizing of the possible outcomes. Indeed, it is the course of action many people took themselves when confronted with similar alternative futures. The innocents were victims of the warrior class choices, not victims of the biblical God and some evil Israelite exploitation initiative. I think the label of war crimes might be appropriate to this situation if it were done today with our modern resources and infrastructure. The justification of the act in the biblical case derives from it being the most merciful, least painful of all available alternatives. In today's world, it would likely not be this. In today's world, a combat mission could easily leave homes, infrastructure, inventories of food, drink supplies, skilled civilian labor and civilian leadership intact, destroying only military sector of the culture. This might have dire economic consequences, but it certainly wouldn't be life-threatening in any meaningful sense. In addition, in the modern world, there are international and regional relief organizations to help with refugees and survivors. But in the case of the ancient Near East and these nomadic plundering groups, all of the males were part of the military sector, and there is no infrastructure whatsoever. There are no inventories of anything. Even the subsistence skills are in the hands of the males. Remember, they had to raid just to get their basic necessities for the group, and most of the transportation, camels basically, would have fled during the conflict. There are no relief resources whatsoever, and they are in the middle of the desert. Of course, this is the reason that the quotes given earlier point out that those who escape from battle die from starvation, thirst, and exposure. It is simply incorrect to place this on par with war crimes motivated by hate or containing malicious and unnecessary violence of innocents, when alternative actions are clearly available. These are war crimes in the ancient Near East, to be sure, ranging from there were war crimes in the ancient Near East, to be sure, ranging from cruel POW torture to civilian mutilation and torture and then execution to gruesome displays of previous victims, but not in this case. The question that might pop up is this one: but if the biblical God was indeed omnipotent, and then it would seem he could have done many things rather than slaughter so many people. And if he couldn't have done anything else, wouldn't this show that he is not omnipotent? Aren't we back to God as either good or omnipotent or not both kind of arguments? The major problem with this is the theological concerning the omnipotence of God. The omnipotence argument can be sketched out like this. A, God can do all things. B, accordingly, God could have resolved this issue by some other means than extermination of a group. C, God didn't use a different method than the one involving extermination. Therefore, either God is omnipotent but cruel because he chose extermination rather than presumably less violent paths, or God is not necessarily cruel, but he's not omnipotent either because he couldn't come up with a non-cruel alternative. Now, this type of reasoning is generally irrelevant because omnipotence normally doesn't play in historical settings. God very, very, very rarely, I'll say this again, God very, very, very rarely overrides normal historical causation and macro-level events. He normally works when he intervenes or overrides it all from the basis of a divine heart, personal characteristics rather than divine power or more metaphysical characteristics. Another way of saying this perhaps was that he generally works in history, not on history. He generally works in history, not on history. In this case, number one, he tried to convince the people for a long time of the dangerous consequences of combating Israel. Number two, he waited patiently for centuries for them to change their minds about their violent anti-Israel terrorism. Three, he apparently convinced some of them to immigrate to Israel and enjoy the blessings of his people. Four, he apparently waited until some Amalekites were away from their main body of the group, since they show up later in the biblical record, implying some survivors who were not involved in that battle. He normally upholds the law of cause and effect and consequences. It is not a lack of omnipotence that is at work here, but rather the principle of God upholding the law of moral consequences within social and cultural context of connections and community. He tries to make the moral universe for those who try to make right and constructive choices by allowing us to see in history and in our own lives and the lives of others the consequences of moral choice and character-based behavior. God binds himself within his choices as well. He plays within the community rules he sets for others. Once historical situation eventuates, he almost always works within the confines of the situation. These are self-imposed limitations, in a manner of speaking, that govern God's behavior as a member and participant in the historical community. God's normal preferred way of working in history is as a personal influence, although on occasion he will act in a judicial power, i.e. the Exodus. To discuss these issues in context of omnipotence may be close to being a category mistake, like talking about green ideas.